thank you for joining us, for coming along to the webinar. As Alison said, there'll be opportunities for some questions at the end. I can't promise to answer any of them definitively, but I'll do my best. And as you know, Alison and James will be debating some of your contributions in the instant messenger as we go throughout. Now, I will be focusing most heavily today on audio feedback as a mode of providing feedback. I will look a little bit later on at what can be achieved content-wise, but of course all of the principles do equally apply to audio feedback. So let's begin by providing some kind of working definition for what I mean by audio feedback. And here we've got some kind of very pithy, simple definition on the slide here. Audio feedback is verbal feedback provided in the form of digital audio files. And I just want to get some feel of whether or not you are using this type of audio feedback, using this definition before we go on. And so I'm going to use some kind of little polling tool we've got within the program here, and hopefully, if I click on this button, yes, you should be able to see a poll asking you, using the definition I've just given you, that is verbal feedback provided in the form of digital audio files, do you currently provide your students with audio feedback? Okay, so if you could just click on that, click on yes or no or not sure if you can. So we've got one response there, excellent. Okay, if you're able to see that poll, okay, great. Hopefully by clicking another button here, I should be able to show the results of the poll to everybody. Right, so we've got a couple of people who aren't quite sure whether they're using audio feedback. Well, as we explore what it is and how it's used, the picture should hopefully become clearer to you. And one person who is sure that they're not using audio feedback. Okay, that's useful to know. So hopefully by discussing some of the benefits of using audio feedback, I can convince you to at least try it out. Right, let me return to my slides. And here they are. Oh, incidentally, that particular definition was taken from this paper here, Brearley and Cullen 2012. And I'm just posting in the instant messenger box here the actual the link to the paper there, so you can go and follow that up if you wish. And indeed, generally, I might point you towards a flurry of articles on audio feedback that appeared in the journal Bioscience Education. Now, my disciplinary background is not in bioscience, not in science at all, but I very much like the audio feedback articles in this journal because they're practitioner focused. They're very useful, and I hope that you find them useful and engaging for exactly the same reason. It's worth noting that as you go away and do some Googling on audio feedback to find journal articles, to find the grey literature online that will help you practically, it's worth bearing in mind that most of the results that pop up are about that horrible whining sound you sometimes hear on PA systems at Highland Games. And so generally, if you're going to search for the right stuff, you need to type in some kind of qualifier, you know, audio feedback students, audio feedback higher education, audio feedback universities, that kind of thing. Otherwise, you'll find articles on the wrong kind of audio feedback. Okay, let's press on. That was the poll. And, well, first and foremost, fundamentally, why might we use audio feedback? GCU at Glasgow Caledonian, where I work, we do have a strategic project, but I have to confess this was not the catalyst for me. In fact, I was thinking of polling you again here and asking you how many of you work at a university where audio feedback is mentioned explicitly in the feedback policy. I thought that would be a little bit unfair and would assume that everybody had read their institution's feedback policy. I'm not sure I've even read every word of mine, to be honest. So there are reasons for doing it, for using audio feedback, that might benefit you as an educator, as a lecturer, and there are reasons for doing it that might benefit your students. Hopefully there's some kind of mutual overlap between those two types of benefit. And we will look at both during this webinar. But let's be self-centered, why don't we? And begin by considering the benefits for ourselves as educators, as lecturers, assuming that that is the main audience today. And certainly, the attractions for me as a lecturer in higher education were efficiency, immediacy, and nuance. Let me unpack those a wee bit more now. I have to admit, I have been known to obsess over the semantics of every single word that I write, so that conventional written feedback can, as you can imagine, take me quite a long time to produce. You know, how long does it take me to write 400 perfectly crafted words? Well, frankly, too long. But 3 minutes of audio takes me, well, 3 minutes to record. And I have to say there's a caveat there. Those type of efficiencies are only achieved with practice. I mean, it certainly hasn't replaced my good habit, I hope, of providing a sheet of general written feedback to the whole class. And that does take a little bit of thinking over. Now, just it takes an awful lot of effort to produce written feedback. So too, I've noticed when I've been providing it, that some students can be uncomfortable in processing this type of written information. Well, so what, you might ask? Can't they learn? They need to engage with written feedback? Well, yes and no. Look, for feedback to be effective, we know that it needs to be used by students, preferably to self-assess their learning. And the first step on that journey of being able to use the feedback is to actually access the damn stuff in the first place. You know, that's kind of important. And it seems that students seem to quite like verbal feedback because it's easy to access if you make it so, it's engaging, it's easier for them to understand, it encourages questioning and discussion. There are lots and lots and lots of good reasons. And that's perhaps why, according to some studies, students are up to 10 times more likely to open audio files online compared to collecting written feedback in person. And in all my reading about audio feedback, and I've done a fair amount of reading now, that's the largest claim that's been made anyway, is that it's 10 times, students are 10 times more likely, which is quite a claim, but worth bearing in mind. Now, let's turn to immediacy and nuance. Well, my audio feedback isn't scripted, so hopefully, because it's not scripted, it feels real and conversational. It means that I can focus on specific issues, I can give clear pointers for future performance, I can sometimes even wander off on very brief tangents with sentences that begin, "Let me give you an example." And you know, of course, that in face-to-face teaching, students absolutely love that kind of thing. Let me give you an example. And I found that's to be the same case, the same with audio feedback. Let me give you a real example of what I mean. And then, of course, there's the personal touch, there's the nuance, which I find can provide a real confidence boost that's simply not available with written feedback. So all in all, it's highly engaging. It seems to demonstrate quite effectively to students that the tutor cares about them as well. You can usually hear in somebody's voice a sense of empathy and encouragement that's quite hard to get across just using the written word. And all of that has got to be good for the satisfaction scores as well. And yes, I will dash off and wash my mouth out with soapy water for using the word satisfaction. But of course, it is something that we all need to bear in mind. Let's move over now to issues of technology. So let's think more about the technical intricacies of the mode. There are lots and lots of ways to administer audio feedback. At the simpler end, you can use something like what you can see on the screen here, using a click and record, click and play function, using a program like Turnitin, which will be familiar to some of you, I'm sure. If your production values are a little bit higher, well, you might record the feedback using a program like Audacity, convert those files to MP3, and then upload those files into whichever VLE that you use. And I know that some lecturers have also emailed the file directly to the students, where hopefully the file isn't server crashingly huge. So what I'd like you to do now, if you're able to, is those of you who think you might be using audio feedback in some form, just type into the text box, into the messenger box there, how you do it. How do you produce and distribute the audio feedback? How do you get it to your students? If you do have a couple of ideas or how you think you might be able to, type it into the instant messenger box now while I'm having a witter. And while you're doing that, I'll run through those options that I've heard are quite popular once again, just to get you thinking. Some options I've heard: using a click and record, click and play function within a program like Turnitin. You could record feedback using a program like Audacity, convert that audio to an MP3 file, and then upload the file into your VLE. Or you could record a file and email that file directly to the students. But of course, you need the feedback, the file, not to be huge in order for it not to crash the server. And I hope anyway that one of those three methods that I've outlined there is something that you could think about in terms of the practicalities of actually producing and making feedback available. For what it's worth, I use both of those first two methods. I use for some of the assignments click and record, click and play within Turnitin. Sound quality isn't very good, so generally if I'm doing something a bit more qualitative, I actually produce it using a program and then hand over the files as MP3. Alison says here, I managed a review of a music school in Guildford last year. They had a fabulous VLE where they could give real-time audio and video feedback on student performance. Wow, yes, that is certainly jealousy-provoking, Alison. I love that. And of course, that's worth pointing out. Sometimes your VLE or your systems will really encourage use of audio feedback, and sometimes they might actually restrict. And we are reliant in many ways on the technology that's available to us. Using MP3 files and uploading them for me was a bit of a workaround, but my students really like that. And now let me move on, in fact, to reasons why audio feedback is beneficial for students, why they like it. I mentioned to you earlier that students, they like verbal feedback. You know, when you're sitting one-to-one with them in a room, they like that kind of verbal stuff. And audio feedback is what I would call a less transient version of that. It's more permanent. Students can go back and listen to it again and again and again. And, you know, when you give students a taste of something, they generally want more of it. And here's an entirely representative quotation from one of my own students, who is a lecturer right at the beginning of their teaching career. Let's see what they had to say. This was the first time, they're commenting on the audio feedback that I've given them. This was the first time I personally received audio feedback. I found it a very engaging way to take part in the feedback process. There's certainly a far more personal feel to hearing your voice impart this information as opposed to reading text. What was good about my blog posts, as well as points to consider for the future, I enjoyed this approach very much, and will look forward to using this feedback to enhance my future work. Oh, great. So this student recognised that I was giving them usable feed forward as well, which was good to hear. So this student clearly likes the nuance of immediacy that was in my voice, which is great to know. I suppose the one counter to all of this is that we have to be careful of the students professing their love for audio feedback simply because it's something new and different, you know, different to the written feedback that they've probably been receiving for years and years. Is it the novelty factor, we should ask ourselves? Well, given this student's feedback that you can see on the slide here, I think not. They make real points about how this feedback was qualitatively different from written feedback, and how it was better in this person's opinion. And I find, yeah, technical point here as well, I find that students benefit from being given instructions, practical pointers on how to use audio feedback. And what you see on this slide here are the instructions that I actually give my students now for how to use the audio feedback that I provide to them. To begin with, I didn't give them instructions, I just gave them the audio feedback. And I started to sense that some of them were using it in the same way as written feedback, i.e. not really engaging very much with it, not returning to it and really interrogating what I was saying. So now I say to my students, listen to the audio file, listen to the feedback 3 times. You know, it's only short. It's only 2.5, 3 minutes at the very most. Make the time to listen to it 3 times. The first time, just listen to the feedback. The second time, take a piece of paper, write down what I've identified in my feedback as the main strengths and main areas for development. And then the third time, just read through your notes and make sure that you've captured everything within the feedback. And my students tell me that that has led to a deeper engagement with points to take forwards, which is useful. Okay, let's move on now to thinking about evidence for why audio feedback is effective. All right, so a lot has been written now on audio feedback, I'm pleased to say, and a lot of good evidence has been generated for why it is effective. It's not just these headline points that I've been trying to persuade you with today. Now, a trot through some of those papers in bioscience education that I mentioned earlier will show you a variety of measures of effectiveness. And they concern things like students' perceptions. You know, how will they use the feedback for clarification? How will they implement the feedback and make it into feed forwards? How does it motivate them? How does it aid students in their reflection? And one thing I particularly like, which is borne out in my own experience, is that it seems to place students one step closer to the tutor's thinking. When you read written feedback, it's quite hard to get inside the tutor's head. But audio feedback, because it's spoken, allows you, I think, to hear the tutor's thought processes more clearly, more closely. It's back to that issue of nuance once again. It brings you a step closer to what the tutor is really thinking, and perhaps crucially, what the tutor is really feeling. Now, that's not my observation. It's the observation of Merry and Osmond in this paper from 2008. And again, a link to that paper should hopefully have just appeared in your messenger box there. And all of that is particularly true when your audio feedback leads the student by the hand, almost page by page of their submission, line by line. You know, you could just replace the block of text that comes at the end of a student submission, the block of text that you write saying, well done, here are the points for development, and you could simply replace that with a block of audio feedback. But the beauty of audio feedback really is that you can do this line by line, page by page stuff. An oldie but a goodie, another paper now to share with you. This idea is covered extensively in Nortcliffe and Middleton, 2008 as well. This is called a walkthrough approach, walking students through their work in much the same way as you would do in a one-to-one tutorial, but you can do it using audio. And actually, going back to Alison's music school in Guildford, well, a custom-built VLE that allows people to do that in real-time audio and video, that is a system that really supports this kind of walkthrough feedback. The reason I'm showing you these papers that, let's be honest, are 10 years old, well, I don't mind 10-year-old. Background is in history, so I guess that 10 years is a blink of an eye to me, but also these papers are 10 years old, and you'd expect maybe audio feedback to be embedded more widely, or should I say more deeply, than it is. Given all of this very high quality work was done 10 years ago, why isn't the practice of audio feedback more wide scale now? It does seem rather strange. Well, folks, that's where you come in, because hopefully those of you who aren't using audio feedback, I've persuaded you of the need to give it a go. Those of you who are using audio feedback, well, you know as well as I do the benefits, the potential, the evidence for effectiveness. And it's you, early adopters, current users, who can be the greatest champions for its wider adoption. So please do use some of the key points from today's webinars to persuade people to just have a go at using audio feedback. Do some of that Google searching to find some of the practical points to get you going. Role modelling also seems really showing your colleagues that the technical considerations aren't too scary. Having them sit next to you at a computer maybe while you're recording the audio feedback and saying, look, here's how I do it. There aren't actually that many steps involved in producing audio feedback. And of course, at a more strategic level, well, institutions need to create environments where audio is possible. The Guildford Music School, I guess, is a gold standard, but there are other things we can do, other barriers that we might need to surmount. So we'll look at that now. We'll have our second poll, looking at barriers to adopting audio feedback. Let me just find that second poll here. Hopefully that should be on the screen. So your question here is, which of these do you think is the most significant barrier to adopting audio feedback? I've given you just a choice of 4 there, and you can only choose one, I believe. So you can answer it from your own perspective, if you wish, or you can imagine that you're answering on behalf of colleagues that you work with. What do you think their most significant barrier would be? Or institutionally, what might be the significant barrier? Okay, we've got some results coming through there, which I'm going to hopefully share with you on the screen. So a couple of people are saying technology-based anxiety. Yes, I agree. When I began my audio feedback journey, and that's where existing structures can really help. You know, at GCU we use Turnitin, which has this little widget at the top of every submission that allows you to just click a record button, and it records the audio feedback and makes it available to students really quite easily. You can then scale up in a more layered way to doing something that's more sophisticated. As always, if you have these anxieties, as most of us do, just find a kind person who will support you through the initial stages if you can. And if you are feeling competent technologically, as I feel I've gained some technological competence over the past few years of using audio feedback, be that person who gets out there and helps other people to begin their journey. A couple of other people saying insufficient quiet space. I think this is a real issue, as we now live in a world where office sharing is much more common than perhaps it once was in higher education. For example, I'm doing this webinar today from home because my partner's at work, my daughter's at school, it's just me in the house, which is, apart from 2 cats, so it's nice and quiet. And I generally do my audio feedback at home too, simply because it's quieter than being on campus. And I do think that institutions perhaps need to have a good think about this. So our wish list for what we might want to address, I guess, would be to flip some of these barriers and create some opportunities for making audio feedback more possible, more manageable. Let's flip back to our slides now. And I wanted to finish by sharing with you my most text-heavy slide. You see, I was doing so well in slide design, but this is a useful slide, I hope, because these are the guidelines that helped me to get started with audio feedback, adapted from that Merry and Osmond paper from way back in 2008. Really useful pieces of practical advice that hopefully you will find simple and non-threatening, as a call to arms as well for your own colleagues as well as for yourselves. So while you're reading through those practical points taken from Merry and Osmond 2008, and remember the link is further up somewhere in your instant messenger, I'm just going to keep my eye on the instant messenger box and see if there are any questions that you have that I can answer, and ignore those that I can't, of course, but thank you for those anyway. So have a read through Merry and Osmond's guide to how to get started, and I will look at your messages and thoughts coming through now. A point Liz made about inconsistent connectivity. Yes, this is a source of great frustration generally, I know, in that where audio feedback can be most useful, it's perhaps around remote learners in rural areas where broadband maybe isn't as good as it ought to be. You know, I'm doing this webinar today for you from the south side of Glasgow, which is very robust in terms of broadband, I hope. I talk to my parents sometimes using instant messenger type, Skype, this kind of thing. They live in rural Norfolk, which is really atrocious for broadband quality, and we struggle very much to do that. And I know in various parts of Scotland that can also be the case too. Rachel says that saying the right things more than technology. Okay, that's a really good point. It takes a long time to craft appropriate written feedback, and I think it would take me equally as long with verbal feedback too. Yeah, that's a great point. And what I would say technically from how I produce my my feedback is, well, in terms of nuance and let's say eloquence, I hope I've got better as I've gone along, and I don't think I was particularly eloquent when I began. I would make notes on a mark sheet in the same way as I might do with written feedback, just bullet points to myself about various things I wanted to put into my audio feedback, and then I would give a dry run without recording myself to see if I could just weave that together into a reasonably eloquent narrative. Often I couldn't, sometimes I could, and then I'd press record and just go for it. And I always found it was very reassuring to me to know that it was only take one. And if it was really useless, and my first efforts were pretty useless, I could just press delete, and nobody would ever have to listen to those stumbling, ineloquent, pretty inarticulate efforts to begin with. But I did find I just got better. It's like with anything. My written feedback, I'm quite certain, was very poor to begin with, and hopefully it's become more nuanced over time. And it's the same with my audio feedback too. But yeah, the power of the delete button. You can record something that's horrendous and just let it go. I hope that helps a little Rachel with anxiety. But yes, you do still need to make some notes, I find, as you're reading a student submission, to be able to craft something, to be able to craft 2 or 3 minutes of talking out of it. Just to read somebody's submission and then talk eloquently for 2 minutes off the bat is really quite a challenge. So don't feel you need to have to do that. Rely on bullet point notes too. Great, I'm glad that's helpful. Thank you, Rachel.